And after you spoke last night, there was a senior Labour politician who went on the radio, a guy called Wes Streeting. I'm sure you don't know. He's the kind of he could be the next health secretary if the Labour Party win the next general election. This is what he had to say.
We're not a party of protest. We're a party that wants to be in government, so we can make a difference for working people.
He's talking about taking on the big vested interest and the vast inequalities in society.
That's what Labour governments do. And with respect to Bernie Sanders, I genuinely think if he'd won the Democratic nomination, he wouldn't have beat Donald Trump at the election. America would be under Trumpism.
Well, let me inform that gentleman, who I do not know. All that was done during that period had me defeating Trump, and I believe I would have defeated Trump.
Yes, folks. Left Reckoning 106. We have to be Bernie would have won till we die.
I think we probably do need to keep that up.
That's just,
That's right.
In this house, we believe Bernie would have won. West Streeting. Why don't you take care of the NHS and stop privatizing it, buddy? And, the point I make, we had our... hello, David. The conversation we had with Heather Mendick last week about the subterfuge of the Corbyn leadership. The only way that he says that it rings true to me is that he knows that like the Clinton and the West Streetings of America would have been undermining Bernie Sanders had he won the primary.
Which is true. I mean, we all know that like Bernie Sanders winning is going to be a huge fight with the state. I don't know. It's so funny. Like one Bernie Sanders, I don't know if you've caught too much of his UK tour. He's been killing it on it so far. And it's so funny just how weak and whiny the goddamn Labour Party has become. That they're treating somebody like Bernie Sanders like that, right? I guess it's funny because like American liberals are always like, well, in Europe, Bernie Sanders would have been a moderate. And it's like, well, actually, that's not really true. Because you can see how they're just as threatened by somebody who talks like that.
Exactly. You cut through that moderate and they sound exactly like Hillary Clinton. Well, getting universal health care won't end racism. Like that's basically what they all do.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, not to be bearer of bad news, but in the interview later with Aminah, we talk a bit about how it's sort of sad how we're all just sort of tailing each other in the US and Canada. I mean, tailing is maybe the wrong way. Like we're all just sort of like doing the same kind of dance and we're in different places. We're on different steps in it in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Pretty damn disappointing. And hopefully we can try to start cooking up a way to get out of this mess.
Yeah. We're in like a round. What's that in singing when someone starts like, I was following
No, we're just echoing over each other. Yeah, exactly. Well, folks, we got a really fun show for y'all. In a little bit, we're going to be joined by Aminah, who wrote an excellent piece for the Rosa Luxemburg Institute. There's a link below for y'all to read it. We talk a little bit about what's going on in Canada with their right-wing movements, but I think more importantly and more universally, talk a bit about, how the right is able to reach certain people who are alienated and are frustrated, and why we should really see that as a challenge for the left, because we should be able to own that space, right? We should be the ones who are able to speak to people who are disaffected. And I think I'm tired of the excuses at this point. I think it's time to get serious and to recognize that that's a problem. And that's really we need to work our way out of.
What's a political fight? I mean, you see that with West Streeting versus Bernie Sanders. West Streeting represents the type who would say like, no, we're to accept what you can get, basically. And like, that's a block. That is a blockage on actual progress. The nominally progressives versus like maybe the social democratic or left wing.
And then don't forget, folks, immediately after the interview, we're going to be going over the post game, patreon.com/leftreckoning, where Matt has brought us some really, really important financial advice about hospitality and who you should be making sure you're taken care of.
Edgar Allan Poe, I don't know if this is apocryphal or if this is true, but Edgar Allan Poe, I believe, said that the two most beautiful words together in the English language were cellar door. Now now a phrase that's maybe the ugliest is landlord TikTok, but that's what we're going to be getting into. We're going to be getting deep into landlord TikTok in the post game, as well as talking about Maggie Thatcher before she was ever prime minister, but she was leader of the Conservative of the Tories, talking with our good old buddy William F. Buckley about.
I'm loving these throwbacks, by the way.
Yeah, we're gonna exploit the Hoover Institution's archive to try to make some profit of our own and reassess the legacy of the sort of Socratic reactionary William F. Buckley.
Well, let's see. Before we get there, should we open up with this commentary? Yes, this is something. I mean, this is something that just frustrates me to no limit, and it's something I've been seeing my entire life on the left liberal side, but I really wanted to focus right now on our side. I'm talking about democratic socialists, progressives, right? And one thing that we just have to get better at on the left, and by left, I mean people who want to see the end of this dictatorship of the bosses and the rich over all of society, from politics to the workplace. One thing we have to get better at is breaking out of this nonsensical and these nonsensical and emotional categories that divide working people in this country. Look, the Biden administration is letting COVID funding expire for the expansion of food stamps and Medicaid expansion, right? And that's going to mean for millions and millions of people lost to access to food, to payments that have been helping people get by. And for people like me, I come up from a poor working class family in this country, right? These were programs that fed me, that cared for me, that made me able to live and survive. So it's very close to home when I see these attacks on them. Meaning for millions of people that they're going to have to find, that they're going to be struggling, that they're going to be kicked off of their healthcare, that they won't have access to these necessary programs that feed and help rear people. The GOP has certainly been pushing it, and certainly in states like Texas, that means millions of people are under threat of losing healthcare, including kids. But it's not just Texas, it's all across this country. And what I wanted to talk to you folks about today is this idea that the left, and I'm talking about democratic socialists and progressives, have to get out of this kind of red versus blue mentality that is so goddamn popular. And a lot of people just can't shake it. It's just so fundamental to the way a lot of people view politics. And if you're somebody who believes that what we should be doing is building working class power, you got to drop that shit at the door, because we have a very different perspective on politics than your typical MSNBC watcher, than your Democratic Party consultant, and certainly the entirety of the Republican Party, right? So we're talking about this onslaught of pain for working people all across this country. And whenever you see these examples of suffering, like what's happening in East Palestine, what has happened in Alabama with the end of the Ware Met coal strike, all across the country, whenever there seems to be a disaster or a problem or a difficulty in a quote unquote red state or red area, you get all these people, this cacophony of sound saying well, those people should stop voting against their interests and start supporting the right people so they don't fall into this problem, right? Which is a nonsensical way of viewing the world. As I said, there's no doubt about it that the Republican Party, for example, here in Texas, is going to be very happy to be throwing people off of Medicaid, to be ending food stamps, extended food stamps for folks at the end of this COVID funding expires, right? But to people in Texas, for example, in Hidalgo County, which voted overwhelmingly for Biden, do they deserve this? In Pennsylvania, where not only Biden won the presidential election, the Democrats were able to win the state house and the governorship. Do we get these kind of op-eds and tweet threads about how those people deserve the punishment for their ignorance? This is nothing new. My whole life, and Matt's yours too, right? We've been bumping around from human crisis to human crisis, avoidable anti-human crisis, because for the Democratic and the Republican Party in this country, working class people are expendable. And we're trying to build a politics that transcends these kind of silly geographical or regional divides that have sort of set up American politics for a long time. I mean, in America, when you don't have a working class party, right, you have to find things for people to hold on to, because while the Republicans and the Democrats don't care about working class voters, they have to find ways to build some kind of coalition so they can win elections, right? And what ends up, taking the place of that, regionalism, urban versus rural, all these kind of things, and they play into it, right? These kind of distracting issues from the fundamental fight that we're all in. I bring this up to say that, like, there's people who are very easily, they look down on people who live in red areas of the country. And I just want to bring up the fact that the class war is everywhere, and you are out of your mind if you think that it's not in your region. The top 5 most unequal states in the country are New York, Louisiana, Connecticut, California, and Massachusetts, right? Only one of those states is one that might ring, a bell for you, Louisiana. They have a Democratic governor, not a good fellow, right? The point here is that inequality, the suffering of working people, is a universal experience in the United States of America. And if you're falling into this kind of false war, right, between the Democratic and the Republican Party, you're not doing your job as a socialist in recognizing that all across this country, working class people are, one, thrown to the wolves, but are left out of the political process, right? And don't forget that the largest cohort of people in this country are non-voters. I'm not trying to make this kind of stupid point that the two parties are the same, but at a certain point, I think that people trying to recognize that there is difference between the Democratic and the Republican Party has gotten people into this trap where they're not able to recognize that what fundamentally unites these two parties. It's a contempt for the working class and an affinity for the rich and powerful. Look no further than what's going on with the railroad industry in this country, right? Where Republicans and Democrats locked arms to block the railroad workers from going on strike. People who are making these demands, not only on things like wages and scheduling, but that the fact is that the safety record in this industry is dangerous, and the workers understood this. And when they came to the government, both of these parties basically gave them the cold shoulder and turned lovingly into the arms of their very wealthy donors, the people who run those industries. That affinity, that unity from the ruling class in this country, that's the biggest threat to working people. The promise of building democratic socialists is not to just sit around and become junior partners of a political institution that is fundamentally hostile to working people. And Lord help us all. If that if that doesn't get through to you, Lord help us. The least we can do is not fall into this trap of identifying people with these working people with these two anti-working class parties. You might think that someone is delusional if they thought Trump was going to wage war on the elites, right? But you were just as delusional if you believe Joe Biden when he said this campaign is about Scranton versus Park Avenue. We've had 2 years of seeing what that looks like. When in the first half of his term, he's been waging war on working class people, culminating, as I just mentioned, in blocking a strike where one of the major concerns led to the disaster in East Palestine. I'm going to bring this up really quick because, the good folks at the Center for Working Class Politics have been doing a lot of incredible work on, looking at what's going on with working class voters in this country. And you look at the polls in this country, and things like Medicare for all, higher, $15 minimum wage, all these things are, incredibly popular, right? We know that we actually have a majority in the sense of like what working people think and what working people want in this country. But the problem is that the vehicles to attain it are hostile to that. So let me just bring this up really fast. The Working Class Center, the Center for Working Class Politics, put out a little while ago. I'm sorry, Matt.
Not good.
I'm having an issue here. Let me make this full screen for y'all. Here we go. Excuse me. The Center for Working Class Politics put out this poll where they interviewed thousands of working class people, right, using a different metric than what is traditional to find people who are sort of left out of the coalition. And they found that working class voters, for example, prefer progressive candidates who focus primarily on bread and butter economic issues and who frame those issues in universal terms. Populist class-based progressive campaign messaging appeals to working class voters at least as well as mainstream Democratic messaging. Progressives do not need to surrender questions of social justice to win working class voters, but certain identity-focused rhetoric is a liability. Working class voters prefer working class candidates. Working class non-voters are not automatic progressives. Blue-collar workers are especially sensitive to candidate messaging and respond even more acutely to the differences between populist and, quote, woke language. And to do this, they basically set up different candidates with different talking points and different platforms, right? And they had a huge example of like different kinds of people, like somebody who might work for like a Wall Street financial corporation or somebody who's a small business owner, right? To see what kind of candidates resonated with people in areas that are swing states, in areas, for example, where Trump might have done well and maybe Biden won in 2020. Because if you're looking at politics on a national level, those are areas where there's a lot of questions that need to be answered if we want to start winning, right? And they found time and time again that talking about things like working class issues, talking about economics, talking about jobs, talking about these things that should be the basis of any kind of left, progressive, democratic socialist politics win, right? So the fact is that we have the ideas, we have to build community, we have to build capacity, and we have to build confidence in folks. And we're offering something that's very, very different from what the Democratic Party is offering. So this reflexive attitude that a lot of people have, where like, oh, well, this community, or this area might be hostile to the Democratic Party, therefore they are hostile to things like Medicare for all, is wrongheaded, and it's dangerous for trying to build the movements that we want to be building in this country. The promise of our politics is that we can do something different. But look, let's play some sound really quick that I think really highlights this point. And I want to shout out John Russell, who's been doing amazing work covering about what's happening in East Palestine. And this is from More Perfect Union. This is him talking to some folks in East Palestine who describe themselves as Trump voters, and just hear what they're saying about Trump, about the state of the nation, about what they would like to see happen.
When they blame a left side or a right side or this and back and forth, we're not tired of that. It's not about, it's about our town now and people not being able to drink the water, about kids having rations. It's about this thing. That's what this is about.
Norfolk Southern. What do they really owe this community?
They owe this community a lot. They owe us property value. They owe us our health. They owe us 5-10 years from now when things are going on.
This company that's owned by J.P. Morgan, Vanguard, and BlackRock. That's not Alan Shaw's a pawn. So he's a pawn. He makes $8 million a year. Yeah. $8 million a year. He lives in an 8,000-foot square mansion. He doesn't care about the people.
They're going to make their money, man. Their trains are going to roll no matter what. Whether we're here or not, we're just ants to them. Industrial accidents can be prevented. Every industrial accident that's ever happened in the country can be prevented. Preventative maintenance.
Trump in 2018, there was, I get the policies. The policies weren't great. That's fine. And you know what? If Trump has to take a little bit of the blame, I'm good with that. But you know what? This administration has had the House, the Senate, the presidency for the last 2 years. They changed a lot of policies.
They imposed a contract and stopped the rail workers from striking. I mean, tell me a little bit, do you feel like the rail workers should have struck?
Absolutely, they should have, because of what has happened.
If Donald Trump was in power right now, what kind of things would you expect him to do to make a situation like this right?
Well, it's not about what I would expect Donald Trump to do. It's about what I would expect the leader of our country to do. And if Donald Trump was here to do something, if he was the president, I would expect him to do the same thing that Biden would do, and that would be to come in here and fix up what needs to be fixed up.
We're not wealthy, we're not the top 1%, but we just want what's
We're not
done
after
right.
for money, we're after for fixing so we can stay where we've lived forever.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, go ahead, man. I just think that really encapsulates like a lot of things that we've been trying to put forward on this program for the past couple of years.
This shouldn't be surprising to anybody. Like, this is the problem with, like, when MSNBC decides we're going to get to know a Trump voter, they're not finding these guys where they're basically saying the Democrats shouldn't have broken the strike. And, it's not necessarily about Trump, but like what the leader do. They're finding like the people who support, separating kids at the border or whatever like that. Right. But like this shouldn't be a surprise. And we talked about this with Luke Savage on the Sunday show. Like Trump's appeal, it was all over the place. But the one that actually turns people out to him, I think, is like the stuff where he's like, people won't be dying on the street, or him, look at him now attacking DeSantis over he wants to cut your Medicare. Like Trump understands this stuff. And that's why like the generic shit about Democrats versus Republicans, like fucking prove it. Like those guys said, you had all this chance and you recently just scored an own goal, if you want to call it that, last fucking month or 2 months ago. And yeah, I mean, it's just, that's it.
I mean, maybe it's just because it's just been my experience. Like, I'm a socialist because I think that we deserve better. I think that my neighbors deserve better. I think that my community deserves better. I'm also a socialist, not just out of critique, but out of like by the fact that I've been inspired by like the care and the solidarity and the well-reasoned manner that most people that I've come up around think about the world, even if they might vote for different presidential candidates, or even if they might do this or that. I've always recognized in my life that working people have a general understanding of the world around them. And we want a world where people who do the necessary labor to make society function aren't living in poverty. In fact, not just aren't living in poverty, are actually living great lives where not only are their needs met, but they're exceeded, right? That is like the thing that gets me up in the morning. That's the thing that has inspired me my entire life to fight for folks, right? And I've told stories before about like some of my early construction work experiences, seeing that kind of solidarity, people from different backgrounds coming together and saying, you know what, we're all on the same side here. The bosses are the ones who are fucking us over, and we're going to demand better for each other. Because not only am I here for you, I'm also doing it for me, right? Because like when you do better, I do better. And knowing that this like level of solidarity exists all across this country. And I just have to say it again, just because there's a segment sometimes of even, unfortunately, our audience that doesn't want to recognize that it happens in places that are quote unquote like red areas. Right.
Yeah, I mean, we're both two Marxists that come from North Dakota and Texas. Like, what fucking more do you assholes need to know? Like, even like I don't mean to cut you off, but Nina Turner's been on this great jag, and like, listen, this is when you at a certain point you need to like go against. There's a rot on partisan Democrat side. And so, like, you see this fucking Adam Wren, and like he might have just been a journalist taking pictures or whatever. But the responses to the scenes from East Palestine, where it's like "fuck Biden," Fisker saying on the Fed, all this right wing shit. In turn, every one of these folks deserves clean air, clean food, clean water, and free healthcare. I'm not sure what folks expected to see when they went to this town, but the pain and anger is. Can I switch to this? No, I can't. I need to change. But
no, I mean, I think that that is just such a fundamental, like that's just like a humanist point at a certain level too,
right?
That, like like not to be all like starry-eyed about democracy, but the idea is that like we're supposed to be able to ask questions to the public, right, about who they want to be in charge, and then at the end of the day we all live in the same country and we look out for each other, right? This kind of mentality that like, oh, people should be punished and some people should be rewarded is so dangerous. One, because what that fundamentally means is that like I'm fine with some working class people be suffering because they didn't make the same kind of gambit that I did. And also, I'm just gonna say this might piss some people off, but also like, look, if you grew up in an area that's blue and like Democratic and you're a Democrat, fine. Right.
Yeah.
But you act like you're somehow different from somebody who grew up in an area that's Republican historically, and they did the same thing that their parents were doing, the same thing that their neighbors are doing. Right. Like you fell into it. Right.
Yeah.
The moralism about it is really disgusting to me.
Yes, and you know what it really is? And it's all these people that respond to Nina Turner. Well, I agree on an intellectual level. Will it change the way that they vote? And they should vote for those things. They vote for dirty air, blah, 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 like this sort of thing. What that is really is victim blaming is like one thing to call it, but it's also cope. It's cope for babies that basically don't want to admit that we don't live in a democracy.
Yeah.
Like that like voting actually doesn't solve all of these problems. It's going to take way fucking more than that, and particularly along the lines that we talk about, which is labor flexing their fucking muscle and developing muscles. And so like all this stuff where it's like, oh, they should have voted. We see what happened. Like Joe, say one thing about Trump and the pettiness of him getting in office and saying, I'm just going to undo this shit because Obama did it, right? Biden should have been doing the same fucking thing about shit that mattered, right? Yeah. And you can draw a distinction that way, but he didn't, and he could have. And you have to ask why. And it's because there's actually not that big of a gap between the two parties. And that's why like these Trump voters in Ohio recognize that's why the Democrats delivered for the fucking rail executives in December.
Was there another Nina that you want to put up?
Yeah, I've got a couple here.
Nina, I think Nina has been excellent throughout this whole thing, like really articulating this position.
Exactly, it's a really worthwhile.
Just like really quick before we go to Nina, also like the vast majority of our audience is really, really smart. So like we're talking to people who already understand these kinds of things. But like on top of just like the fact that like we should be looking out for all working people in this country, this is the other promise of like Bernie Sanders and this kind of politics is that we can like unite people in a way that the Democratic Party never could.
Yes.
Right. They could never do that. But like, you know, the potential with the Bernie Sanders style, like kind of politics, the potential with democratic socialist politics is that you can bring a lot of people together who might not fit into like a typical, maybe even Democratic Party coalition or Republican Party coalition, right? Because when you speak to working people about working class issues, when you place things in the context of class war, and we're living through it, we're literally, these are bombs being dropped on communities as a part of class war, right? That's what these are. When you're seeing these derailments, that's a person who controls a corporation saying, I don't give a shit about the dangers that this might mean for different people, particularly places like East Palestine. So I'm just going to pursue profit at the expense of safety, at the expense of safety and just reasonable, rational management of these kind of systems, right? That's fallout from class war when you see these kinds of events, right? You know, there's nobody home in the sense of like the government there being like a proper response, because Biden doesn't want to touch it, because Biden doesn't want to have to go into conflict with the railroad executives, and Trump doesn't want to touch it because Trump doesn't want to go into conflict with railroad executives because they represent them. They don't represent you. Right. And the hope and the dream and the idea behind this kind of democratic socialist politics is that we can cut through that bullshit and recognize that the largest category of people in this country are working class people, and we are in the majority. And if we're able to be united, that we can actually get things done. Because just hoping that there's this right constellation of certain members of the ruling class in the sense of the Democratic or the Republican Party that's going to be able to deliver for working people, it ain't going to happen. It hasn't happened. And if we keep on waiting around for it, things are only going to get worse.
Yeah, here's a few more Nina tweets. Trump voters don't deserve to have their towns poison period. And just look at this reply. It's like, so they don't agree with you. I agree with you. And then scroll a little bit more. But come next election, will they vote anti-regulation candidates into office, right? Just Nina goes on to say the disconnect to say put people over party to this, shake my head. You know, and she quotes somebody, voting has consequences. They reap what they sow. Like, again, this is, like I said, like, it's victim blaming, but it's also cope. Voting is not this. Voting is not this powerful. Otherwise, you know, we'd have universal health care in this country. They reap what they sow. Maybe they'll start to understand that the next election put people over party rather than the inverse, and hold their elected officials accountable.
What do they want to happen in the sense of like, who is the fucking president right now? Who was in control of Congress for the past 2 years, right? If you don't want these things, if the argument is that like, well, we need to have the right people in this position and then these bad things won't happen, right? And then, well, the right people, according to you, were in that position and the bad things still happen. What the fuck do you want? Like the idea behind it is cruel and sick, but we actually have the counterfactual like in front of us right now.
Yes.
What about the people in Hidalgo, Texas, who voted for Biden? Right, and are now going to see, healthcare disappear and food stamps disappear. What about the people in Pennsylvania who voted for Biden and voted for the Democratic Party for the governor and the state house, who are going to see those same effects hit them? Right, it's a nonsensical anti-solidarity divisive argument that is so prevalent on people who, instead of wanting to look at the folks in power, they want to look at the powerless, right? And that is the function of this division in American politics today, that instead of looking at the people who are responsible for these crises and getting mad at them and organizing against them and trying to build something, we instead are just pointing fingers and yelling at each other, saying, you didn't line up in the way that I want you to. And also, I guess if you did do the right thing, you're also just going to get punished because the people who we say you should be supporting aren't going to do shit for you either.
Yeah, they did the best they can, and it was not enough. Yeah, exactly. And again, just one final one. The likes of Norfolk Southern are buying politicians so they can keep poisoning our communities for a quick buck. There's no need for them to nationalize railroads. And I think people make a point of Sherrod Brown a little bit late to this too. And I like Sherrod Brown. I think as far as Democrats go, he's good. But this is in concert, right? The slow rolling of the response to this. Buttigieg knew DeWine wasn't doing this much, so he didn't have to do this much. This is a concert, this sort of thing. And so shout out to folks like Nina, who Democrats really get upset by. And by the way, a victim of AIPAC money. Just to bring a full circle there.
Well, look, the thing is that this isn't new. These parties both sort of settled. There's regional shifts, but in the sense of these being the two major parties, this settles Civil War era, right? This has been what has sort of been in place. So generations upon generations of Americans have sort of been living through two ruling class parties, eking it out against each other. And there's a lot of lessons, right? As I said earlier, the idea that basically, one party control of the state, meaning that things are going to get better for working people. Again, as I said, you look at the states that are the most unequal in this country, it shows that look, it's great to have rent protections. It's great to have, certain things. I'm not saying that there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats, but what I am saying is this idea that what the role of the left should be doing right now is to be sort of lining up between one of these people as their fervent supporters is just wrongheaded and dangerous, right? Because this has been the fundamental characteristic of American politics, because we have not had in a long time a socialist or a working class party. And I just wanted to go to Eugene Debs, who has a lot on this, and maybe we should just do a reading series on some of his stuff, Matt, because it's just at the same time as when we were doing this Rosa Luxemburg, sometimes it can be inspiring and also frustrating to read people from the early 1900s writing about today. But this is from Eugene Debs, I believe in 1910. So long as workers are divided economically and politically, they will remain in subjection, exploited of what they produce, and treated with contempt by the parasites who live out of their labor. The economic unity of the workers must first be effected before there can be any progress toward emancipation. The interests of the millions of wage workers are identical, regardless of nationality, creed, or sex, and if they will only open their eyes to the simple self-evident fact, the greatest obstacle will have been overcome and the day of victory will draw near. And the point that he's getting at here is that all of these things that are sort of set up to divide and prevent this possibility of working people uniting and recognizing the power that we have, the importance of that solidarity, and how effective and how afraid the people in power are of that reality happening. The more that we don't recognize it and fall into the traps that are being set and being active participants in those traps, you are working against yourself and your family and your community and your neighbors by playing into that thing. And people on the left and socialists have to not only be better than that, we have to be a model for the people who were sort of bringing along with us and educating and showing a different way of doing politics and thinking about the country and thinking about the world. This is the way to affect change instead of attacking other people who are suffering because of this hellscape of international and national capitalism in the United States of America.
And it's really foundation. We talked, I forget what his name, the guy we talked with the St. Louis Commune, but the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, rail, and basically that was when basically this sort of liberalism and the reactionaries came together and is oh yeah, we can't allow this sort of disruption. We need to come together, and they're literally we're fighting the Redskins as they said, on the plains, and the reds in the urban areas. And the newspapers, the mainstream newspapers like your New York Times, your New York Heralds, they were conscious about that. We need to stop occupying the South, and we need units that can respond to strikes and respond to the frontier genocides that we're committing. And we're in that exact same pattern now. And like, so Buttigieg and like these sorts of folks, they represent that type of progressivism, and you know, it's progressive in the way that we don't necessarily like.
Yeah, I mean, stay tuned to Left Reckoning for more of that. I think that for the most part, socialists have sort of shook that off. I hope, but I think that things could be made a lot more clear. Because I think at a certain point, like the silence and the timidness that a lot of people have to sort of be explicit about what our critiques of, like having secret criticisms of the people in power, right? Sometimes like quiet criticisms, you know what I mean? Like we're just doing it internally instead of sort of doing it publicly, only helps to marginalize us, right? Because if people are fed up with these folks in power, they should be hearing that, like, oh wait, you know, these people who like, yeah, you know, the right's trying to get you worked up about, or the people on Fox News are trying to get worked up about, actually think very similar things to you about who's fucking you, and who, you know, who we should be actually targeting and actually challenging and actually going into conflict with. You know, it's a disservice to us to not be really explicit and open about these things in the terms of like careers or respectability, right? Or, you know, being taken seriously, right? At a certain point, what we're talking about is fundamentally shifting these dynamics. And I think people need to get more explicit and loud about these things instead of sort of wanting to swim in the same waters as a certain kind of elite political class because you think maybe they'll give you some treats.
I 100% agree. I mean, that's why like I appreciate Nina Turner not like willing to like, you know, pick those fights and also like, you know, quote tweet minor accounts to really drive home the point, because it is it's really a sickness. It's disgusting, and it's a great point to like intervene and like use it to discipline, but or differentiate an actual, you know, new political consciousness from, you know, these sorts of you know, milquetoast freaks.
Yeah. Well, talking about trying to build a stronger left, we're going to jump over to the interview. Don't forget, folks, that will be at the post game right after that, patreon.com/Left Reckoning, where Matt has some pretty exciting updates on landlord etiquette that you probably haven't been following, maybe should.
Landlord TikTok, baby, a truly cursed area of the internet that I've been privy to, and also we'll do a little bit of Maggie Thatcher and William F. Buckley, two primetime creeps in 1977. So see you at the end of the interview. But this is a great interview. I watched it, but sad I couldn't be there at the time. But we should get Aminah back.
Yeah, for sure.
Here we go.
Welcome back, everybody, to Left Reckoning. Dave here, as always. I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Aminah Sheikh, who is a union organizer and the author of this really excellent piece that was put out by the Rosa Luxemburg Institute. And y'all might know we've been reading a lot of Rosa on the show lately, called "The Right Wing is Organizing in Canada. Can the Left Learn to Stop Them?" Thank you so much for spending some time with us today on Left Reckoning.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Well, I mean, I really loved your piece, and, you know, being able to talk to you. I think that, you know, we're sort of thinking similarly about, you know, some of the issues that the left is facing. And, you know, one of the things that I think you start to learn as you start talking to friends and comrades who are involved in, you know, politics in other countries is that, like, a lot of these hurdles are unfortunately similar, different in different contexts, but there's a kind of universal difficulty, I think, that left movements are facing. And I think before we get into some of the more broad, like, universal context, you know, could you give, like, our American listeners in particular a kind of sense about what's been happening in Canada, particularly with, like, the right wing and, like, their version of right wing populism there?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you having me. And I think that it's important to talk about the right-wing organizing, as I call it, and movements that are growing in Canada. And I would say that these movements started pre-pandemic, but I think with the pandemic, we were able to see it more, or I was able to see it more. And I just want to say that my understanding of organizing comes from being a union organizer. I'm not a political scientist or, a professor, but just from knocking on doors and seeing what was going on, I was assigned to rural and northern areas in Canada. And I was talking to you about that a bit, right? And I was saying how you saw the rise of, literally the raising of flags that say, F Trudeau. I won't swear on the show, but the F Trudeau flags you see, and they were as high as a new party that was forming, which is called the People's Party of Canada. I don't know if your viewers know about it. I'm sure they do because they're nerdy, I'm sure. So the People's Party of Canada is this libertarian, ultra right-wing party that was formed and was running candidates, in periphery, what I call periphery areas, so outside of the city. And people in these parties and linked with different movements, right-wing movements, were also obviously anti-vaccine mandate. And really, I just saw it increasing with my own organizing work, and I thought it was important that we talk about it.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, I think that sometimes people fall into a trap of sort of seeing things and some of the maybe the demands or way that these frustrations that people are feeling are being directed, and sort of discounting the fact that like there's a lot of pain and frustration that folks are feeling. I mean, could you talk about some of like the leaders and movements in Canada in this kind of right formation?
Yeah, one of them's name is Pierre Poilievre, and I've even noticed, I'm in the US right now. I'm actually in Rosa Luxemburg's office in New York.
We love the photo behind you.
Yes, I tried to get her in, and her book's back there. But I really think what I've noticed is even people here are watching the videos of the new Conservative Party leader named Pierre Poilievre. And I think that's really important because he's very confusing, and he's meant to be confusing. He attacks Trudeau, he attacks the elite, right? And he's a populist leader, and he's really resonating with working people and average people. And I don't think people think of him as right, left. I think we really need to understand that people aren't necessarily so sectarian and tied to ideologically to a party. I think what they are feeling is anger about the current crisis, the capitalist crisis. And we know when capitalism is starting to is failing, it's now fascism is developing, I think. And I know I didn't say that, somebody said that, but I think fascism is developing, and I think we're seeing it in Canada. And I think Pierre Poilievre stands out, his TikToks stand out because he has championed himself as for the average guy, that folks, and he's from Alberta, and he sort of talks about, growing up with parents who were teachers. So they kind of always make these links to average people, but at the same time, if you look at their history, he was applauding Stockwell Day and the Conservative Party leaders who fired thousands of teachers in the 1990s. This is a person who also is vehemently anti-immigrant. We see him right now asking Trudeau, attacking Trudeau and saying that we need to close the borders. So it's also that sort of Canadian nationalism. I'm sure you see that in the US, that is sort of tied to the fascism. And then you also are seeing them being supporters of provincial sovereignty, which I wasn't always nuanced on this, but now you're starting to see Alberta saying they want their own country, and that we need to get rid of the federal government and that government is too large, and that really we need to get rid of social safety networks and all of that, and that we need to have freedom. I guess that's freedom, right?
It's funny to hear that about Alberta. I mean, this is the tangent, but I remember there was a bunch of neo-Confederates here in the States who put together this really, like, I mean, neo-Confederates are insane generally, but like this really wild map of like the new Confederate States of America, parts of the country that like want freedom, and it was, you know, the South, and then it went all the way up to like Idaho, but they included Alberta as part of that, which I don't know, interesting to hear that something similar about that now. But I mean, you know, it's you know, I don't mean to make light of it. It's something that's very worrying, and yeah.
Texas and Alberta, I think, have a relationship.
Right? I know a lot of people from Alberta. Yeah, no, you know, it's oil, right?
Oil, I don't know.
No, for sure. But like, I mean, you know, I want to talk more broadly about, you know, what opening they're taking advantage of. But, you know, as like an organizer, somebody sort of watching this, I mean, could you talk about how the right in Canada has sort of been utilizing like social media, digital media, new forms of communication to sort of push this message that they're sending folks?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's super innovative, but it looks innovative because I think unions, and that's where my expertise is the union world isn't using digital tools correctly. And that is what I write about in this piece. And I've written about it before too. And this is coming from me, who I believe in one-on-one relational organizing. I was trained in a method that comes out of SEIU, one of the largest private sector unions in America, and is in Canada too, and they are renowned for their grassroots organizing and door knocking, traditional relational organizing. So I was reluctant of digital tools for a very long time, but the pandemic made me shift my organizing method and find tools that were complementary. And so I really do want to say that's what I believe in, that we have to find the tools that are complementary to the ground game. But what I argue all the time with the unions is, and with the left, that includes the party, is that I don't think that they're using the tools in the right way. For example, I think that we should be complementing our direct actions. So we should be having ID'd leaders in the community that are organic leaders, and that's another thing I mentioned, that are organic. And we should be building up their online platforms. And so we need to develop this. And I think that we haven't, where I think the right, I've been watching, they have these like charismatic, savvy, I mean, to me, it's like, I'm trying not to be rude, it's like crazy town, but it's like, it's captivating, and that's the point, right? And so when the Freedom Convoy kicked off, when the quarantine and the vaccine mandates were at its peak, we saw the Freedom Convoy, which what people call the truckers convoy. They weren't truckers, but when they kicked off, they were live streaming. You know, they have a lot of energy. There's a lot of charismatic leadership. And I don't want to name people because it's not about them, but I think that the left has not done that. And if they do find people, it's like very contrived. And I know that's in the US too. They're hand selecting these people who have no history of doing anything. And it's very careful and it looks careful. And I think where you see a sharp contrast too in the pandemic is the right looks like they're fighting. Like I always say this, like their leaders look like they're in a boxing ring boxing, okay? Where our leaders look like they're like crying for some reason, and they're like sad, and they're like, reluctant to engage. It's a fight. The fight started a while ago, you know, and we're still like crying, and it's ridiculous. And I think I think in Canada, people don't even look at the NDP. Like it's not even a party that anyone cares about anymore, you know? And until they do the more aggressive tactics digitally and then build with on the ground campaigns, that will help us get further.
Well, I mean, I definitely want to talk more about the organic leaders in a second, but I'm just curious if you could, enlighten me on this, because in the U.S., what we were getting a lot about the trucker convoy protests was something that I think we see a lot here in the States as well, where basically, there were a lot of arguments that like, oh, well, these people are all people who make like maybe $100,000, $150,000 a year. So they're not, they're like cosplaying and not like accurately representing these demands. You think that that's an accurate way to view that?
No, I think, okay, so I took time to think about it. I think that people who are out there like for a couple days, some of those people, yeah, they're getting paid. Maybe it's some sort of AstroTurf, whatever everybody calls it. But some of those people are actually genuinely were unemployed people who, maybe were working couple odd jobs and, were collecting unemployment insurance or something. But there were people who were genuinely into it. I do think also a lot of people watching during the trucker freedom convoy were sympathetic. Okay, including people in my family. I'm sure other people's families. This is everybody's neighbors, everybody's cousins. Like everybody was talking about people who were anti-vaccine mandate. And I was really teaching in my organizing curriculum that you can't just constantly insult people and say that these people are dumb. I don't agree with this, and, I think, and they're not politically correct. I think we have to learn to engage and we have to have conversations online and more importantly, offline. We have to have tough conversations with our relatives, our neighbors, and all these people who actually do sympathize with these ideas. And it's because there are no alternative ideas. So it feels like people are gravitating and jumping on this because it's at least somebody addressing their anger about the housing crisis, their anger about inflation, interest rates, and, Pierre Poilievre is an example of somebody who attacks the Bank of Canada, who's attacking the elites. And I think the left needs to respond, and they have not been responding. And so we can't just insult people because those people are our neighbors, our relatives, our friends, like I was saying.
Yeah, and I think in general, too, that in my opinion, I think that, we needed to have pretty serious COVID measures. But the fact of the matter is that both in the U.S. and from my understanding in Canada, it was fairly neoliberal, where a lot of people were sort of being thrown to the wolves. And of course, the right is going to come in there and say well, basically what we need to do is to not treat this like a pandemic. We just need to act like nothing's wrong, which is, extremely dangerous. But the left sort of got caught in the middle of on one time advocating for stronger protections and mobilizations from the state, while also sort of wagging their fingers at people who were upset because they weren't able to make a living, their lives were getting more and more difficult, etc. Yeah, I think that there's it was an unfortunate moment, and in fairness, it's a hard thing to sort of be thrown into. I'm just saying with the pandemic in general, and to cultivate stronger responses to these things. But I think that point about the freedom convoy is well taken, because I was never really too certain or comfortable with the argument that I was hearing from people in the U.S. about it. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about organic leaders, because I think that that's a really important point. And I know it's sometimes difficult for us, people who might hold more radical politics, sometimes to talk about the left, because it's a lot of different groups. But I do take your point that there is a kind of NGO apparatus around building leaders for left movements. You see it from things like climate change is one, where you have sort of people who are appointed to be spokespeople of communities who might not accurately represent what people in those communities think. And yeah, I'm just curious, as an organizer and as a thinker, what should we be thinking about when it comes to trying to develop more capacity for having more organic leaders for left movements?
Yeah, I think that what I did write about is that we're not developing and training people. We don't have secession plans. I know in the unions, speaking from the unions, we don't have secession plans. So you have somebody there who's been a president for like 40 years, you know what I mean? And it's like, it's ironic because we talk about democracy and then we like point our fingers at other countries, but it's like we have union presidents that just won't leave. And but we are seeing some change. I want to be positive. Like a major union called OPSU just had a amazing election and a new president. It's bringing vibrancy and it's bringing organizing back. And we're seeing some changes in various unions, and they also have jumped on the organizing that's coming from Amazon, that's coming from like all the private sector and workers who are essential workers who've been organizing. So there's a lot going on, but still we're not pulling out organic leaders. If anything, I argue that we're afraid of them. And that's because we still have more of a business unionism or labor liberalism. Joe Burns writes about this, and I think it's accurate. It's labor liberalism. It's like, you know, I'm going to pick out a perfect looking person in a place and run them against the Conservative Party, but I'm not going to train them. So it does a disservice, like what I've seen in Canada, it does a disservice to the token person that they picked out too, who isn't supported by anything. And then the person themselves isn't good enough. Like we need to have more of an intersectional, you know, approach to IDing people. Also, we need to build many leaders. Like we have to stop doing this individualistic, I call it like celebrity activism, you know. No, we need like, if it's a group of 100, then you need 10 leaders, you know. It's about, you know, Bernie Sanders said it, not me, us, right? I think when we constantly make it about me, and I'm seeing a lot of people doing the I and what I experienced and like individualizing everything still in these movements, we have to make it, no, we are us, all of us, you know, and we have to bring other people forward. And I don't fully see that happening, but I'm optimistic.
I mean, I can't agree more. I mean, in the States right now, it's sort of like, I mean, like, you know, like I'm all for Bernie. I think that campaign really opened up a lot of doors, but I think it's created some kind of sloppy thinking or some inherited tendencies where the question now is like, who's going to be the next Bernie Sanders? Like, who's the next leader that we can all sort of line up behind, when, you know, all the experiences over the past few years have sort of taught us that like one of the frustrations that we have is that like whatever you want to call the left in this country, whatever you might want to call the labor movement in this country, there's a pretty sizable gulf between the people who are its representatives and like the base. And we get frustrated a lot, and we think if we just sort of yell and clamor, and like, I don't think that that's wrong to be upset with people who are, you know, supposedly representing you. But like, if that's our strategy, like we're just going to lose perpetually, right? Like there has to be much more rootedness in these movements if we want to be able to act in concert, to act strategically, to understand the desires of people involved in these things.
Yeah. And I also don't want to like be negative. I always say I don't want to be negative, because I do see a lot of positive things happening. Like I wrote that like just a couple months ago, you know, 55,000 educators in Ontario, you know, engaged in a strike that was deemed illegal by the Conservative government. And honestly, that was a moment that like really brought everybody together, and it brings, and it, right wing, left wing, whatever you want to call it, people were like, 39,000 is not enough for early childhood educator. Like everyone agrees on it. So these ideas are actually just common sense, you know, people understand, people are also all tied together, right? So people are married to paramedics, people are married, or their families are teachers. And so everybody feels interconnected and cares about this. And we need to use these moments to continue more direct action as well. Like we need to get our unions to engage in strikes, to not just do concessionary bargaining. I also think that we need to bargain for the common good. And I think we're seeing that in the US. We need to, in our agreements, we need to, in our bargaining and negotiation, we need to talk about housing, because it's all intertwined. We need to go beyond monetary items only. And I think if if we do, we'll be the most successful. But at this moment, it still feels like there's no political will to fully organize, I feel, in Canada. And that is why I'm scared about these right-wing people, because they're so confusing. Like, you don't even, I was talking to you about this, you don't even, and they really resonate with people about their alienation and their loneliness. Like the current prime minister in Italy I was telling you about, like, really scares me, and I think that's something that would work here. Like, people would feel like they want something like that,
No, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, the ability of the right to be able to speak to people's alienation is it's not good that they're able to run circles around us on that right now. I mean, I think that's just something that the left should be able to own outright. And I think it sort of shows a disconnection, I think, from a lot of the people who with influence and the base. And I do want to talk a little bit more about like that alienation and that in just 1 second. But one more like particular question about Canada, like you're seeing these kind of mobilizations from the right. I mean, you mentioned it a little bit before, but like, how is like the NDP reacting to that? Or are they not reacting? Or are they not reacting well enough to some of these fissures and divisions and mobilizations in Canadian politics and society?
It feels like the NDP doesn't react, and they're very comfortable. And, I don't want to be conspiratorial, but I've had to think about this too. I'm like, what is going on? Like, they must be just content with how things are, because it just doesn't make any sense to me. They had so many opportunities, and it's like, the leaders of these parties, both in provinces and federally, like, I don't know where they've been. And if they are on their social media, even that's lame. I'm sorry, but it's lame. It doesn't resonate with people. They don't get it. They're still so afraid of their own base. Like, this isn't just when Aminah came along. I had communist trade unionists telling me to give up on it, because it's like been going on for a while, and it's since been for 30 years, if not more, since they took out socialism from the Constitution, since they purged, obviously the Red Scare and all that happened in Canada. So it's just like the party's just flat. And I think that I look at their content and it's just, their slogans are just not enough. One slogan's enough is enough, actually.
Yeah. I think it's awesome. We're just going to keep borrowing from each other for a while. I think in the UK, they borrowed one of Obama's slogans too for the Labour Party a little while ago. And it's just, I don't know. It's a funny thing that we're all just sort of marching towards a darker and darker future and just trading a failed strategy after
it's true. And it's like, if you want to borrow something from Corbyn, or borrow something from Lula. I don't know. Like, why England? Like, why Britain? I don't know.
It's pretty funny. This is a distraction, but you might like this. Talking about Lula, we have these. A Brazilian friend of ours sent these to us because Lula was giving these speeches where he was saying that all working people deserve to have picanha, which is like a nice cut of beef. And I won't do my Lula impression for you right now, but he describes it perfectly. Like, he's like the fat dripping off the back and like a cold beer. And Bolsonaro shot himself in the foot, I think, with this, because he printed out a bunch of free picanha cards and handed them out around Brazil, I guess, to like ridicule Lula, but it only, I think, made him more and more popular. I definitely agree that taking some lessons from Lula is something we should certainly be doing in the UK, US, and Canada. Yeah, I don't know. This last week we had a guest on from the UK too, and talking about what's happening in the Labour Party there, and it's interesting because I think we all sort of watch each other's politics and the ups and downs, and like sometimes I'll look at the NDP and be like, well, at least it would be nice to be able to participate in politics without having to touch like the Democratic Party here. But as you're saying, it seems to be, unfortunately, just as flat in a lot of ways as like the larger progressive movement. I'm sort of excising the Democratic Socialists from that. But, when we're talking about this, I mean, I think it's always better to go back to like the people and go back to the class. And like, in your experience as an organizer, somebody who's thinking about these things, somebody who's talking to folks, like, we're seeing these kind of openings for the right to speak to the alienation and struggles that working people are feeling. And how do you think that we can get better on the left at sort of being able to speak to that, being able to mobilize that frustration, instead of sort of propping up the political careers of like right-wing charismatic folks into sort of building a better future for working people?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think we need to go back. I've been saying this, we need to go back to relational face-to-face organizing. So if you work in some place, you need to go back to trying to make attempts to meet people in person, outside, connecting with people, and building those relationships again, because I think people are really lonely on their tools. And I think that we can succeed if we give them community. I think that that's what's lacking in North America, is community. And something deeper and stronger. And I think that once we have community and we have some relationships forms, then we can win people over to our ideas. Because like I said, I don't think people are ideologically devoted to right-wing, anti-state, libertarian, hate even. So I think that we have to go back to making those connections. And it's difficult because now people just want to be by themselves, and people have a lot of social anxieties and don't want to make those connections. But we have to keep trying. And so what I mean by that is like, try to make meetings in person, try to connect with people in person, so that we can talk about things. And then the other thing is we have to stop putting people down for having a different idea. So when the vaccine mandates were happening, we have to have a conversation about it. Like make people think and give them answers. We can't just, again, patronize people. And also we have to understand regionalism, or like we have to understand that, if I'm from the city and I'm going up to a northern rural area, like what are their priorities? And stop putting your own priorities onto other people. I always say this, like stop assuming, and then also stop assuming everything about people. Like sometimes people go out to a rural area and they'll be like, oh, you didn't say XYZ in a right way. And it's like, well, you're first of all assuming they don't know, they don't have those experiences, they're not living those experiences. But their priority right now is urgency around bread and butter issues, right? And I think that the city dominance and the dominance of sometimes the parties and all these structures, they're very patronizing to working class people and working poor people. Right? And so we have to start by listening.
Yeah, I mean, I think like building community is something that like we desperately need. I mean, like on a political level, but like also like on a spiritual level too. I mean, people are really alienated, and like that's how you build trust and comradeship with folks. And I think that the famous like Margaret Thatcher quote is like, there is no society, there's like individuals and families. Like she might have got her wish, in the sense that like those really seem to be like the few social blocks that we still have under neoliberal capitalism, and like building that up. I mean, sometimes people ridicule left groups for trying to do like social events that like aren't particularly about like politics, in like a general sense. And it's like, I think this is exactly the kind of thing that we should. I think it's important to walk a line and not to just basically turn things into a pure social group where like all you're doing is just like hanging out with 20 people and doing barbecues, right? We need to be engaged in politics. But I don't think that we're at anywhere near a place where we've overcorrected so far that we're too social. If anything, I think we're not social enough.
I agree. Yeah, I think that we're not even doing barbecues anymore. Like people aren't even eating together anymore. I listening to even just the Amazon labor union, and they talked about like eating together.
Yeah, no, those were, and like in those events, from what I wasn't able to go in person to any of them, but they seemed like they there was like a fun like kind of party atmosphere to this kind of thing, and like I think that we have to be able to recognize that like socialism should be like a social thing, and we really need to be leaning into that, because look, it's not my cup of tea, but like you can see that people are having fun at some of these right-wing things that are going on, right? They're going there and they're doing whatever they're doing, but they're in like a community that can feel really powerful when you're feeling really alienated. And again, like it's something that we so easily could be doing. And I think, as like members of this, especially rank and file members of like organizations and unions, the onus seems to be like it's going to have to come from membership on these things, because the leadership hasn't seemed that they're very interested in trying to build these things up as much as they should.
Speaking of leadership and parties, I'm reading this book right now. I thought I'd plug it.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, you should. My friend Paul Prescott has been trying to get me to read that for the longest time. I think that I just ordered it. You've been enjoying it so far?
Oh my goodness. And I'm in New York, so I'm like, wow, like so much history. And I'm like, where are these people? But this local like had, I don't know what's it called? Like it had a club. The local 64, maybe somebody can correct me later. Like the local had their own disco or like, and like members like loved it. And it was like communist, and like, it's a great book, honestly. And it talks about Tony's life, and I just started it, but yeah, I brought it to plug it in too.
No, I'm happy that you do that. No, we should definitely do something on Left Reckoning about that. And like another thing, like Anton Yeager has some really great pieces in Jackman about populism and about isolation. And I think he wrote a review of the famous book Bowling Alone, and in it he makes this really interesting point. It wasn't so much the context in North America, but in Europe, a lot of the left and like social democratic parties, like, you went to like a barber that was like affiliated with the party, like you socialized in a bar. And we the thing is, right now we're in a really rough place, and I'm not like a doomer or one of those people. I'm frustrated, but I'm also hopeful. That's why I criticize these things, because I think we can do better, and I believe we can. The one silver lining about sort of being disorganized is like, this is a great time to start building up those capacities in those communities. Because like, what else do we have to lose? I think that, getting serious about building community and building, class consciousness is something that like is material. It can be utilized in the short term, and more importantly, in the long term, I think it will set us up to be able to build strong movements that are able to develop and realize real gains for working people. Because like the other thing too, I don't want to keep you too long, but the other thing too that I'm curious what you think about that I think is also tough is like, you want to build community, and also like if you're going out of your community, right? If you're going from a city to a rural area, like you really have to be there, because like here in Texas, like, liberals from Austin have gone to rural towns forever, and they've promised them a lot of really, really nice things, and people might agree with you. They might say like, oh, Medicare for all sounds good, Green New Deal sounds good, whatever. But that's not going to happen. And most people's experience, whenever politics comes into their life, that means that things are about to get worse, not better, typically. So like there's a lot of work we have to do on the left, not just to win people over, right, which I think a lot of people focus on, but to actually build people's trust that like, when we're talking about a better world, it's something that we can actually achieve, instead of me just talking about, my favorite imagination of what the future could look like.
I completely agree with you. And I think both of us believe that it's possible, but yeah, and we could go on, because we saw that in the Sanders campaign, or we saw that in certain campaigns where, they didn't spend enough time in communities, and then they just sent someone from a city, again, who's never even visited Detroit, you know what I mean? Or flew them in to run a campaign, and you can't do that. You have to take time, and you have to ID leaders and activists and build them so that they can do it for their community, for themselves. And I think that like we have to be positive, and so I want to be positive about all this. I do really tell organizers and activists that like this is just a moment we're living in, and it's okay to make mistakes. I read a Malcolm X quote yesterday about making adversity and mistakes, and it's like we have to learn from those mistakes. And it's attached to other moments, and it's attached to other contexts and situations. We're all interconnected, and we can't just be so inward thinking and narcissistic that it's all about this moment right now.
I think that's perfectly well said. Folks, the piece, there's a link below in the show notes, but if you're listening, it is at rosalux.com. The right wing is organizing in Canada. Can the left learn to stop them? y'all follow the lead here, and we should all read the Tony book. Aminah, thank you so much for joining me today on Left Reckoning.
Thanks.
So let's just say it one more time because everyone went wild about the book. The book is Tony Mazzaghi, The Man Who Hated Work But Loved Labor. Which is
I knew the second I saw that it was the mirrored feed that the chat was going to go insane without being able to decipher.
I mean, I think that people always talk about you got to watch the Yellow Parenti, the Michael Parenti video.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I'd like to read the Tony book, something that we start seeing on the left too.
Yeah, I need to read it myself.
Yeah, let's maybe do a good LR reading series. Well, folks, we're going to go to the.
Speaking of which,
what
do we want to? Well, speaking of which, the LR reading series.
Yeah. Oh, you want to pump this weekend?
We'll be and speaking of Rosa Luxemburg, we'll be continuing our Rosa reading series part 3 this Sunday.
Yeah, so if you've been curious about Rosa Luxemburg and you've heard the name but you don't know much about the theory, because Rosa's already such an incredible political figure, but is one of those characters, and it's always unique and powerful when you have somebody who's just as strong as a theorist as they are like a participant in politics and history. And Rose is certainly one of those people. So I think we have 3 parts up already.
Was it 3? I thought it was 2. I think 2, but maybe not. Well, the next part.
2. I think maybe 2. But anyways, both of those are now public. So if you want to catch up on those, you can get them. And then for patrons this weekend, we'll be doing part 3 or part 4. We have to double check which one it is. But we're reading Reform and Revolution, which is an excellent, excellent text. I don't know. I really love doing those reading series with you, Matt. It's always fun to jump back into these.
Yeah, and I really think learning about more of the sort of experience of people like Rosa, I think that's really the inoculation against sort of over pessimistic doomerism, because things have never been easy, and the hill has always been, frankly, pretty titanic, and it's just, it doesn't change the nature of the process that we have to go through, and I just think it. Now, people talk about the internet, we're so exposed to stuff, and that's basically the difference now with how bad things are, I think.
Yeah.
Well, but Rosa's wild because, sorry, just to keep going, how aware she is of all these dynamics that we have an overabundance of information on, and she nailed it through pamphlets and newspapers.
No, you're right. Yeah, she wasn't able to just go on the Bureau of Labor Statistics and stuff back then. I really want to thank Aminah. I think that's an interview I was really happy to do and to have put up on the main show tonight. People should definitely read the piece. There's a link in the show notes below. You can also find it on the Rosa Luxemburg New York City website. We're going to go over to the post game. Want to remind folks, though, really quick, if you like the show and you're not able to support us on Patreon, but you might want a t-shirt, we're doing a 15% off sale with code LASTRIDE. You can get that at leftreckoning.com/store. These shirts, the LR on the Road shirts, are low in stock, so we only got a couple left. So if you want to get them, you can't wait. They're going pretty fast, and I don't think we're going to be able to be making those anymore. But folks, we're going to go over the post game. Matt's got a pretty exciting update on what's going on with landlords and the customs and traditions that I think many, many Americans aren't respecting. So he's going to school you all a little bit on that. We're going to be visiting our nemesis, Buckley and Thatcher. We'll also be taking your calls and questions. You can leave us a voicemail at 1-940-289-7234. Sign up at patreon.com/leftreckoning. We'll be over in the post game in just a couple minutes. So show's not over. Just join us over there.
Peace.